Thanks, Erin. You go ahead and go to the first slide. That would be great. Super. So good afternoon, everybody, or morning, depending on where you are. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Megan Forbes, and I'm the co-director for the It Takes a Village project. So for those of you who aren't familiar, It Takes a Village was initially funded in 2017 by the IMLS to bring together open source programs serving cultural and scientific heritage, to develop shared sustainability strategies, and to provide our communities with the information needed to assess and contribute to the sustainability of the programs they depend on. So sustainability is one of those words that means many different things in many different contexts. So for us within the ITAV framework, sustainability is defined as commitment and resources available at levels sufficient for the software to remain viable and effective as long as it's needed. So the output of the first It Takes a Village project was a guidebook designed to serve as a practical reference source. And then in 2020, IMLS funded a second phase called It Takes a Village in Practice, which created an adaptable set of tools for use in planning and managing sustainability. Next slide, thanks. So the core output from our initial project was not a list of defined characteristics and specific steps to take to become sustainable, right? So instead, we found that programs of all different sizes, funding models, and end user communities could be sustainable. But what they all had in common was that all the sustainable programs that we worked with grew from projects that were direct responses to community needs, rather than, ooh, I've got a good idea, let me go see if anybody is interested. The next thing is that sustainability isn't one thing, right? It's not a straight line. It's not this path that you follow. Rather, it's got facets that move in these phases sort of together and separately. So those core findings turned into the It Takes a Village framework, and I'll share just the 30,000-foot view of that now. Next slide, thanks. So there are many elements that go into open source sustainability, but in the course of It Takes a Village work, most of our participants and contributors coalesced around four main facets. So governance there on the top left, that's about establishing a model in which roles are defined for project participants and support the process for strategic and tactical decision-making in the project. Technology, obviously, we're talking about open source software projects, and there are parallels with proprietary software development, but then added challenges because of all the other facets, right? Because of community and governance and resources. Resources, right? We need human and financial resources in order to grow and thrive. And then the final facet is community engagement. And this reflects efforts to foster involvement within a community. So encouraging people to join, to participate, to champion the work that we do. Next slide, thanks. We identified 3 phases of development within each facet. So getting started is generally used for OSS programs that are the early stages of planning, design, and development. Work's often grant funded and kind of focused on fulfilling the terms of that grant. Growing phase, that's going to be the broadest in terms of breadth of range, right? This is, elements of an OSS program can take a long time to grow along a number of pathways. This can be considered the danger zone, right? Programs can stall here or go away entirely if their efforts fail to take root. In this phase, it's really critical to sort of complete that transition from grant-funded or niche project to sustainable program. And then the assessing and evolving phase reflects a more mature program that's reached an established stage. It has those predictable elements, but where stakeholders need to be vigilant because it's easy to sort of be complacent. Hey, we did it, right? And then you don't want to stagnate. You don't want to be replaced by more novel technologies. So continued progress might require shifting back to the beginning. So maybe you're in assessing and evolving, and then you're going to go back to phase 1, for example, with your technology, if you decide on a platform re-architecture. Next slide. So when we put those phases and facets together, we get this beautiful wheel. At first I had an animation that actually spun it, but it actually made me a little nauseous. So I took it out, but you can imagine that these phases sort of turn. You can be a phase 1 in technology, a phase 2 in governance, right? You're not sort of tied along each of these phases and facets. Next slide. So a lot more information about all of those phases and facets, more definitions, more objectives for how to move forward from one phase to the next can all be found in the It Takes a Village guidebook, of course, freely downloadable and available at itav.lyrasis.org. And then the next slide. And then, as I mentioned, in 2020, IMLS funded a new phase of It Takes a Village work called It Takes a Village in Practice. And that was to create and pilot a set of tools for practical use. You'll hear that word a lot. It's practically my middle name, in planning and managing sustainability. So in that screenshot at the right, you can see some of the tools that we've developed to support work in phase one of governance. So things like figuring out, why do we even need governance and what type of governance structures are out there? So again, that whole toolkit with probably close to 80 different activities is all available online, itav.lyrasis.org. Next slide. And then, so some of you might be thinking, hey, other than Samvera, I'm not working on any open source programs, and they already did It Takes a Village. So how useful is this toolkit for me? So of course, I'm here to tell you it's very useful in a lot of different contexts. So the IMLS funded us to focus on open source programs serving cultural and scientific heritage. So that's what we did. But many of the activities that we developed can be useful for teams who are working on any kind of open source program, working on other kinds of programs, right? We all have programs, they're not all software related, and there's lots of tools that are useful for that. The tools can also be useful for teams that are thinking about implementing open source programs. So even if you're not a member of the program team, you're not on an advisory board, you're not a software developer, there are still activities that can be really useful. So Erin, I'm just going to name 3 real quickly so you can just click through sort of as I name them. So the first one here is catastrophizing, and that's going to help identify like all of the things that can go terribly wrong with your project. It's great to get them out so then you can figure out, you know, can our governance handle this? Do we know who's going to solve the problem? Do we have a mitigation plan? The next one is about understanding financial resource models. So it's a way to have a guided conversation about how can we earn some money to make this program financially sustainable. The last one is documentation friction logging. Have somebody go through your documentation and say how well it works. Were they able to complete a task? Did they get frustrated? Did they throw their computer against the wall, right? And we have documentation for everything, right? Not just software, not just end user stuff, but, you know, how do I reserve a conference room in the library, or all kinds of things that we might have documentation for. So lots of different activities that are useful. And then I know we're very short on time, so just very quickly with the next slide. If you are interested in using the toolkit, we've developed some kickoff materials that can help get you started. And so they'll help your program agree on current sustainability status, figure out what your priorities are, how you're going to choose those It Takes a Village activities, and then a checklist to figure out what phase you're in. So Erin, you can just skip the next couple of slides and go right to Heather, who is going to talk about Samvera's experience with the It Takes a Village kickoff and analysis.
Thank you, Megan. All right, so in the Samvera community over the last year, we've done a number of activities. We applied in, I believe, in early 2021 to be a pilot community for the toolkit. And we were invited to pilot at the end of 2021. And then next slide. So we did our kickoff in April. The kickoff was done with the Samvera board with Megan as a wonderful facilitator and also Lori Arp from Lyrasis. And we discussed those facets that Megan mentioned. We have spent the last several years really focused on governance and community building. So we were really looking at and discussing where the technology and sustainability facets might be relevant. And as a result, we selected, or the board selected, technology as the area of focus for the work we would do piloting the toolkit. So next slide, yes. And then as we were doing this, because as Erin will shortly share with you, the Fedora community was also piloting the toolkit. We had Rosalind Metz come to the spring partner meeting, and we did a sustainability activity that Fedora had used, and it was really useful. We did a diversifying income streams and adjusting existing revenue streams activities, learned a lot, talked about it a lot. The board took it from there, and the result was we decided that we learned a lot from the activity, but that this kind of sustainability work really wasn't going to be our focus in 2022, and that it's something that we'll revisit next year and think about, but but for now, we're going to sort of not touch our revenue streams. But it was super helpful, and it can be helpful to know and say, hey, we're just not going to focus on this right now. So that was our bonus sustainability activity. And then next slide. So at the June board meeting, the board members voted asynchronously, narrowed down from this great big long list of potential technology activities, voted to narrow it down to 2 activities. We sort of voted on 4 and then narrowed it to 2. It kind of selected the 2 activities, talked about who should be involved and when we should do them. And the next slide, we had our first activity in August. So this activity was called Does the Shoe Still Fit? It was focused on identifying and discussing technology stakeholders. The members of this activity were community technology leaders, so past and present tech leads and product owners and others who were sort of taking the lead in different aspects of Samvera technology. And we were talking across all of the technologies, not just Hyrax or Haiku, but sort of trying to look more broadly and talk about stakeholders, broad stakeholders. So that was a really great activity. We selected 3 stakeholders to focus on, and there were 12 potential goals that came from those for better understanding our stakeholders and their needs, or also addressing needs that we were already aware of, that these stakeholders had already made us aware of. So the next slide. So then we did some refinement. We had all of these goals, these possible stakeholders. So it moved back up to the Samvera board. They discussed and selected the stakeholders to focus on and the goals, and then a small group of board members refined those into 9 goals. So next slide. So of course, we weren't going to be able to take on 9 goals. So we were really trying to focus on what we could do in 2023. So the board discussed and sort of widowed down to the goals we thought were achievable and measurable and something that we could take on for next year. So we discussed those with partners at the fall partner meeting just this month. And the result is our 2023 goals that you see here. So these are the goals that Carolyn talked about in the State of Samvera presentation. So these are 3 things that we have committed to do next year. And it felt really good to get to these through this activity where we were sort of moving from making sure we were able to include a large number of voices and then kind of talk about what was possible, what might be possible later, and saving all of the information that we built up along the way so we can look back at those goals later and say, okay, well, what didn't we do that maybe would still be useful? So it was a hugely useful activity. And the next slide. So our other activity is called the List of Dreams activity. It's where we would brainstorm ideas unconstrained by current features, technology capabilities, funding, any of those usual constraints. We brought together another group, a lot of the same folks who were in the stakeholder activity and also some other folks who weren't able to join that activity. And it was really fun to see everyone brainstorm. And we were thinking across all of the Samvera technologies, but also sort of things that don't currently exist, but that would fit under the Samvera mission. So we're talking about a lot of different technologies. And the idea with this activity is you come up with all of these ideas, you sort of group them together, and then select 4 to further investigate. So it doesn't mean we're going to do these things, but they're things where we might want to start looking now at what technology do we need to do these things, what skills do we need in the community, and so forth. So next slide. So that activity continues today. We have a Birds of a Feather session where we're going to continue to talk about the 4 ideas and what it would take to investigate them. And it's been a really fun activity. So anyone is welcome to join us in that activity later on today. And some takeaways, it worked out really well for us to spread these activities across the year. It gave us time to get input and refinement at different levels and to move from the board to community members and back as we defined these goals. So we're going into next year with these goals ready to go. The activities were excellent. They went really well. And one thing that I noticed was that virtual whiteboards were a huge help in this, and Zoom has recently integrated a virtual whiteboard. So that I think is worth checking out for doing these kinds of activities. Now I'll hand things to Erin.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks for setting this up. I think as I'm listening to Heather's part of the presentation, it's really interesting to hear same toolkit, same framework, but different approaches to how we go about it. So I'm going to give you a brief rundown kind of on what the Fedora community did with It Takes a Village. So we started our work in January 2022. We released 6. There wasn't a large feature roadmap. So governance really wanted to sit down and take the time to kind of chart our path forward, but in a really structured and organized way. So we approached lyricists and Megan and Lori about running It Takes a Village, and we decided to undertake this. So the governance chairs at Fedora and myself, we sat down and we had some very concrete timelines about how long we expected this work to take and what we were expecting in terms of participation guidelines. And not as a barrier for participation. We were asking for quite a large time commitment from the folks that we wanted on board, but we wanted to make that very transparent and clear to anybody that was joining us in this activity, because we were essentially strategic planning for the entire community kind of as a path forward. So we made these very clear expectations, and then we formed our strategic planning subcommittee. And so what we did is we sent out an open invitation to all governance members first, which formed kind of the basis of our planning committee. And from there, we made some very targeted outreach to specific individuals within our community in hopes of bringing a broad range of voices to the table. So we needed representation from our sister communities, from Samvera and from Samvera, from Islandora, from OCFL. We also really wanted voices from outside of North America who are typically underrepresented at our decision-making table. And then we also wanted technology folks, so people that were a little bit more deeply familiar with the core software itself. So then we brought the group together, we did the kickoff, and from there we formed 2 smaller working groups from our one large group to tackle 2 facets that we identified in the kickoff. And those were, for us, it was resources and community engagement. And we set our meeting schedule here to kind of tackle those. And then, once the time frame was over, the idea was that we would create a report to present to governance with our recommendations for next steps. So the one resource that we chose was, the one facet that we chose was resources. And we all came at this with the understanding that it meant not only finances, but people and skills. So our Fedora committer team is quite small, very engaged, but quite small, but we were looking for ways to expand this subset of skills and also engagement that's non-technical. So how are we going to involve more parts of the community as part of it? So one of the main goals, though, was to evaluate the current membership model, and explore new avenues for increasing revenue. We did 2 activities with this smaller subgroup. We did diversifying income streams as well, and we also did adjusting existing income streams. So the results of these activities were we did a landscape analysis of several open source programs and their funding models. We sent out a community survey that was focused on gathering some really basic financial information from our member institutions. And the survey results actually served, many purposes beyond just that, and gave us a really kind of broad understanding of challenges and the needs of our members as it relates to paying for memberships and the specifics of their processes involved at each institution. So this is background work that we still are working with. It is, we did the legwork in strategic planning, if you will, and we have a lot of useful insight and a lot of important information that we can take away from this. We did, just really quickly to touch on the tools that we worked with, we used Miro for group collaborative brainstorming, which is a free tool that you can use online. We definitely relied heavily on shared Google Docs and spreadsheets for collaborative and asynchronous work. So just, you can see in the slide there a couple of the screenshots. And then the other facet that we had was community engagement. So here the goal was to find new and better ways to engage with our current community and also identify areas where we needed improvement in connecting with those stakeholders. So we did the identifying stakeholder gaps activity. And one thing that we kind of identified early on here is that we do a really good job of communicating with the people who already use and know about Fedora. But what we needed to find out was where we weren't. So if that kind of makes sense, we knew that we did well at talking to people that knew about us, but now how do we get to where we aren't? So, you know, there's this education piece missing that we identified. A lot of people in high level roles at decision-making levels, they really don't know what Fedora is and why it's important. So we needed to use these activities to kind of develop a plan for how to reach them and how to get the information in their hands. So we are in the process of doing that. We created some really clear objectives and clear communication guides, I guess, if you will, and with the help of our organizational home at Lyrasis and the marketing team there, we are in the process of drafting a marketing plan. And really quickly here, I'm going to go through our quick lessons learned. It's been a great tool for us. It's been enlightening and helpful for us thinking to the future. It gave us this structured and organized way of executing this very large and overwhelming concept of strategic planning. That can be very daunting. And It Takes a Village really broke it down into actionable and chunks that we could manage kind of in one sitting. We learned a lot about our views and how we see ourselves as a community and where we foresee the program going. You know, we were able to discuss some things where we didn't align. It's all on the table now so that we can tackle it kind of going forward, so that, you know, as a united front, we can be a little bit more powerful than a fractured one. And so one of my biggest takeaways from this was that sometimes what you think you need isn't actually what you always need. So I was very sure that the only two resources, or the only two facets that we were going to need to focus on, were technology and resources. You know, we didn't have this technology roadmap. We needed funds to continue. But the community spoke, and that wasn't the same thing. But these facets are also interconnected. We were going to touch on those things by tackling these other facets. So that phase analysis really made that very clear, that the group was not as focused as I thought as we would be on technology. You know, we know that 6 is strong, so this was one of our biggest takeaway. And just be patient. Don't rush the work. It will happen. Change doesn't take place overnight. So just be patient with it. So, and I guess we got less than 2 minutes, but Megan, if you want to say one last thing here.
Sure. So if anybody is interested in spending a little more time with It Takes a Village, check out the website. We'll say it's in beta. It's brand new. So if you find something bizarre, let us know. ITAV.lyrasis.org. And if you end up doing any of the activities, we're still looking for feedback. A lot of them haven't been tested. A lot of them have, by Fedora and Samvera and others, but a lot of them have not been tested. So if you click on any of the pages on the website, you'll see that there's a nice little click here to provide feedback. So if you could just click on that, you know, what's the activity? Who are you? What did you do? What would you change? That would be super. And then if you want to engage Lyrasis, you can always email Lori Arp at Lyrasis if you want somebody to sort of help facilitate any ITAV activities for you or your program.